May 1940, the most powerful armored force on Earth, sits idle, engines cooling, guns silent, just miles from the sea where 330,000 Allied soldiers are trapped, with nowhere left to run. The German commanders are ready. The kill is within reach. And then an order arrives from the highest authority in the Third Reich. Stop, not because of fear, not because of weakness, but for reasons that have haunted historians for over 80 years. Because what happened next didn't just save an army, it saved the world. Welcome to WW2 Ghost Wings, where the untold stories of history's greatest conflict are finally given the voice they deserve. If this is the first time joining us here, a very warm welcome indeed. And if returning, it is always a pleasure to have such fine company. Now, if real history moves something deep inside, if these forgotten stories feel important, perhaps consider subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing, and it means these stories can keep reaching people who truly care about them. There's a little button nearby. It would be wonderful to have you as part of this community. And a small question: where in the world is this being watched from today? Whether it is a quiet evening in England, a Sunday morning in America, or somewhere unexpected entirely, drop a comment below. These stories belong to all of us. If real, unfiltered history is something worth protecting, a like on this video helps more people find it. And turning on the notification bell ensures that not a single story gets missed. Now, back to May 1940, and a decision that no military textbook has ever fully explained. The maps were wrong. Every map in every Allied headquarters across France, wrong. Every prediction, every strategy, every carefully drawn defensive line, wrong. Because no one had truly believed it was possible. No one had genuinely accepted that a modern army, the largest, most prepared coalition in Western Europe, could be dismantled not in months, not in weeks, but in days. Yet, that is precisely what happened. In the spring of 1940, Adolf Hitler unleashed something the world had never seen before. Not simply an army, a doctrine, a philosophy of war built on speed, shock, and psychological devastation. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And in May of that year, it struck with the force of something that felt less like a military campaign and more like a natural disaster. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. While Allied attention focused on the Franco-Belgian border, where conventional wisdom demanded the blow would fall, German armored divisions were threading silently through the Ardennes forest, a route every serious military mind had declared impassable for tanks. A route that had been left almost entirely undefended. On May 10, 1940, the trap was sprung. Within 72 hours, the front had fractured. Within a week, the Allied forces were no longer conducting a defense. They were conducting a collapse. The French command structure, built on the rigid lessons of the First World War, could not process the speed of what was happening. Orders arrived too late. Reinforcements moved too slowly. And by the time the full picture became visible, it was already too late to change it. The British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 of Britain's finest soldiers, found themselves cut off, separated from their French allies, pushed northward toward the English Channel, toward a small, unremarkable port town on the northern coast of France, a town called Dunkirk. In London, Winston Churchill, only days into his tenure as Prime Minister, was receiving reports that bordered on the unthinkable. The army that Britain had sent to defend Europe was now trapped against the sea, surrounded, exhausted, running low on everything, and the Panzers were still coming. The stage was set, the players were in position, and somewhere in the German high command, a decision was forming that no one could have predicted. If this story is already pulling at something, please do consider hitting the like button and sharing it with someone who loves real history. These stories deserve to be heard. It was not a bomb that changed the war. It was a signature. May 24th, 1940. Late afternoon, at the German Army Group A headquarters, a single directive moves through the chain of command, quietly, efficiently, with all the bureaucratic stillness of a routine administrative decision. But there was nothing routine about it. Führer Directive Number 13, the order that would later be dissected by historians, debated in war colleges, and mourned by German generals in their post-war memoirs, commanded the Panzer divisions to halt, to hold their positions along the AA Canal, to advance no further toward the trapped Allied forces bleeding at the edges of Dunkirk. The officers in the field could not believe what they were reading. General Erich Hopner, commanding the 16th Panzer Corps, was within striking distance. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg itself, had tanks that could have reached the beaches in hours. These were not men given to panic or exaggeration. These were cold, calculating professionals, and they understood with absolute clarity that the order they had just received made no military sense whatsoever. So where had it come from? And more importantly, why? The answer, like most truths buried inside the Third Reich, was not simple. It was layered, competing, and deeply revealing about the fractured nature of German command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had expressed genuine concern about the condition of his armor. The Panzers had advanced at ferocious pace, over 250 miles in 2 weeks. Tracks were worn, engines were strained, supply lines were dangerously stretched. Rundstedt's caution was, in isolation, militarily understandable. A destroyed armored force could not fight the second phase of the French campaign, the drive south toward Paris. Hitler listened, and Hitler agreed. But Rundstedt's caution alone does not explain the full picture. Into this moment stepped Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal, head of the Luftwaffe, and a man whose ego had always outpaced his judgment. Göring contacted Hitler directly. He made a personal promise. The Luftwaffe, he declared, would finish what the Panzers had started. Air power alone would destroy the Allied forces on the beaches. The army need not risk its precious armor. Hitler, who harbored a deep ideological faith in air power, an equally deep desire to demonstrate Göring's worth, agreed to that as well. But there was something else, something darker beneath the surface. Hitler, in the spring of 1940, still harbored a peculiar, almost delusional belief that Britain might yet negotiate, that if the British army was allowed to escape, humiliated but alive, Churchill's government might accept terms, that destroying the BF entirely might harden British resolve beyond recovery. It was not mercy. It was miscalculation dressed as strategy. 3 forces had converged in a single fatal moment: a general's caution, a vain man's ambition, and a dictator's political fantasy. And together, they left the door open. History does not always turn on cannons and cavalry. Sometimes it turns on a fishing boat. May 26, 1940, 1857 hours. The British Admiralty transmits a single coded signal across the English Channel. 7 words. No elaboration. No ceremony. Operation Dynamo is to commence. What followed those 7 words was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It was something far more desperate, far more human, and ultimately, far more consequential than anything the architects of the Third Reich could have imagined when they issued their halt order 2 days prior. The beaches of Dunkirk were not a defensive position. They were a wound. Stretching across 40 miles of flat, exposed sand, hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited, bomb from above, shell from perimeter, and staring at a channel that offered salvation just 21 miles away. The largest professional army Britain had ever assembled had been reduced to men standing in lines in the sea, waiting for boats that may never come. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from a room carved into the white cliffs of Dover, was given 9 days and an impossible task: evacuate 1/3 of a million men from a hostile coastline, under active enemy fire, with naval force wholly inadequate for the scale of the operation. So he did something that no military manual had ever prescribed. He called for the small boats, pleasure cruisers, river ferries, fishing trawlers, private yachts, lifeboats pulled from dockyards, vessels with names like Sundowner, Tamzine, and Mary Jane, boats that belonged to weekends and summer afternoons, were requisitioned, crewed by civilians and retired sailors, and sent into a war zone. Meanwhile, above the beaches, the Luftwaffe was discovering the limits of Göring's promise. The RAF, outnumbered, exhausted, and flying from bases across the Channel, fought with a ferocity that disrupted German air operations far more than anyone in Berlin had calculated. The soft sand of Dunkirk's beaches absorbed bomb blasts that would have been lethal on harder ground. Cloud cover intervened at critical moments, and the Spitfires, invisible to the soldiers below who often saw only German planes and felt abandoned, were bleeding in the skies above. Göring's guarantee was collapsing in real time. By June 4th, 9 days after Dynamo began, 338,226 men had been pulled from the edge of annihilation. British, French, Belgian soldiers who had every reason to believe their war was over, boarding destroyers, fishing boats, and pleasure cruisers back to an island that refused to accept defeat. Churchill stood before Parliament that same day. He did not call it a victory. He was too honest for that. But he understood, with the precision of a man who had studied war his entire life, what those 9 days truly meant. Wars are not won by evacuations, he said, but they can be, because the men who came home from Dunkirk did not go quietly into defeat. They went to North Africa, to Sicily, to the beaches of Normandy 4 years later. They carried Dunkirk inside them, not as a scar, but as a reckoning. Hitler had stopped the Panzers, and in doing so, he had stopped himself. This is one of the most debated moments in the entire history of the Second World War, the pause that may have cost Germany everything. What are your thoughts on it? Drop a comment below. Was it miscalculation, delusion, or something else entirely? This community loves a real conversation. Some mistakes announce themselves loudly. Others whisper for years. And then one day, the silence breaks. The soldiers who waded back onto British soil in the first days of June 1940 arrived without their tanks, without their artillery, without most of their equipment. By every measurable military standard, they had been defeated, routed, driven into the sea by a force that had outthought and outmaneuvered them at every turn. But they were alive, and in the mathematics of a long war, that fact would prove to be worth more than any tank, any artillery piece, any abandoned weapon rusting in the sand of French beach. Hitler waited for the call that never came. In the weeks following Dunkirk, the German leadership genuinely anticipated some form of British diplomatic overture. Peace feelers, back-channel negotiations, a pragmatic acknowledgement from Churchill's government that continuation of the war was futile. Hitler even made a formal, public peace offer to Britain in July 1940, a speech before the Reichstag that he clearly expected to be received with at least quiet interest. Churchill's government did not even formally respond, because the men of Dunkirk had come home, and with them, something that no evacuation was ever supposed to produce. Not relief, not gratitude for survival, but fury, a cold, clarifying, unshakable fury that transformed a military humiliation into the psychological foundation of Britain's entire war effort. Churchill had understood this instinctively. His speech to Parliament on June 4th, delivered on the same day the last boats returned from Dunkirk, was not a eulogy. It was a declaration. Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets. It would never surrender. Those words did not emerge from arrogance or theatrical defiance. They emerged from the simple, devastating fact that 338,226 men had just proven that survival itself was an act of resistance. The consequences of the Halt order did not end in 1940. They compounded, year after year, with devastating interest. The British army that escaped Dunkirk rebuilt, re-equipped, and re-engaged. At El Alamein in 1942, it broke Rommel's Afrika Korps and turned the tide in North Africa. In Sicily and Italy, it ground northward through some of the most difficult terrain of the entire war. And on June 6, 1944, for years, almost a week after the last boat left Dunkirk, it returned to the continent of Europe through the surf of Normandy. Many of the men who waded ashore on D-Day had once waded into the channel at Dunkirk. The circle, in the cruelest possible way for the Third Reich, was complete. History has long debated the precise weight of responsibility for the Halt order. Rundstedt's caution, Göring's vanity, Hitler's political miscalculation. The truth is that all three forces were present, and all three contributed to a decision that defied the fundamental logic of the military situation. When a surrounded enemy is within reach and total destruction is achievable, hesitation is not strategy. It is surrender disguised as patience. Hitler never fully recovered strategically from the ghost of Dunkirk. Every subsequent campaign, the Battle of Britain, Barbarossa, the long attrition of the Eastern Front, was fought against an adversary that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been eliminated in May 1940. The additional burden that Britain placed on German resources, intelligence, logistics, and morale across 5 more years of war traces its origin to a single afternoon on the AA Canal. One order, one pause, one open door, and through it walked the army that helped in the Third Reich. The story of Dunkirk is not simply the story of a miraculous escape. It is the story of what happens when the instruments of total war are wielded by a mind that was, beneath all the spectacle and terror, profoundly and fatally flawed. Hitler